I love coming to TAM, and it's my honor to come here every year. I'll keep coming until you guys lock the door on me. You guys are my people. How many of you have yelled at me at the television while watching the show? See? We're having a conversation that way. But actually, what I want to talk about bears directly upon my introduction, which is my resume. People give an introduction, then they give my resume. And because I've enjoyed a certain amount of success in my life, it's easy to perceive me up here on television, on stage, as having a fairly linear path towards my success. And nothing could be farther than the truth. I know that also we are inundated with successful people telling us that, oh, well, they failed more than they succeeded. In fact, one of the greatest shows ever made for television was Aaron Sorkin's first show, Sports Night. And at the end of the second season, Dana, the main character, meets a guy who's going to buy her television show. He's going to buy the Sports Night show. And he has a company called Quo Vadis, which I think is Latin for "Where are we going?" Am I correct about that? Okay. And he says to her, he's a billionaire, he's developed some software thing, and he says, "I've failed far more than I've succeeded, but the question I'm always asking is, Quo Vadis, where are we going?" That's what I say to my people. And I notice that successful people are always saying something like that, but they're not telling you how it works. They're telling you that they failed in the abstract, but I think the concrete example is an important one. I mean, when I say that I failed, my first job as a PA, I was given the keys to a truck, and then I got into another truck with a guy who was driving, and I drove 2 hours to a location. So the first truck stayed where I was formerly for 4 hours while they came and found me and got the keys and then fired me. I've caused car accidents. I've yelled at my kids and scared them. I've been divorced. So I know failure. I have been there. And I want to tell you about, within the one step forward, 2 steps back, that all of our lives encompass, that there is no exception here. In 1985-86, I pretended to attend NYU for a year. I didn't really go to class. I got a job at the 8th Street Playhouse where the Rocky Horror Picture Show fad began, and as a projectionist. And I fell in with a group of friends who are still some of my best friends in the whole world. And because most of them were going to NYU Film School, I spent the next 3 or 4 years after dropping out of NYU getting an ersatz NYU Film School education by working on all their films. And the first and biggest one that I worked on was for my friend David's senior thesis film called Gargoyle and Goblin. Super ambitious fantasy film taking place in Times Square, helped by the fact that David's grandmother, Grandma Celli, owned all the male porn theaters in Midtown. And we had a whole block of empty buildings, each with its own power distribution, because we kept on blowing them out, to shoot in. Empty rooms, empty buildings. We shot in the building, the theater that Fanny Brice's husband built for her, which was, at the point we were filming it, the Adonis Theater. And David asked me to art direct it, and I wasn't qualified to do something like that, but if I say so myself, along with the help of some amazing people, some of them have gone on to be really, really big in production design in Hollywood, we knocked that movie out of the park. It won the NYU Film Festival Best Art Direction that year. It was absolutely gorgeous. We had a tremendous amount of fun, and for a student film, I mean, we shot 16 nights in a row in Midtown Manhattan, sleeping on site in one of the buildings in this dormitory that we made up. I mean, the camaraderie, that early camaraderie of doing a project like that, and busting your ass and killing yourself and succeeding at it, was really thrilling. And I felt like this is something that I could do. I dropped out of NYU. I thought I wanted to be an actor. I wasn't so sure at this point. Maybe I wanted to be a filmmaker. Art direction, it really seemed like it suited me. I've been making things all my life. I have been using my skills. This might be it. And so I started putting my name out there. You know, I could art direct your film. And my friend Gabrielle asked me, she was a film student who was producing her first student film, and asked me if I would art direct it. Now, Gabby was a really, really close friend of mine. Within this close-knit group of about 10 or 14 friends, Gabby and I were extremely close. And she asked me to do this, and I said, yeah, absolutely. This is great. She said, the director has saved up money working at 7-Eleven all summer long. He's got an $850 budget for the art direction. And I thought, that's shitloads of money. That's plenty. And the subject of his film was an ATM that talks back. I did a version of this talk at Make It Fair, and I kept on saying ATM machine. And it's the only emails I got from people about the talk were, don't say ATM machine. It's an ATM that talks back at its balding owner and makes fun of his toupee. So they needed one of those rooms where the ATM is, the glass doors and the enclosed room. They needed control over this room. They needed to they needed basically to build it. And I said that I could do that. I figured I saw them build flats in high school when we did the high school plays. I mean, how hard is that? It's just like a frame of wood, you stretch the canvas over it, and you paint it. Yeah, I could do that. And the clear doors, we just buy some sheets of plexiglass and we paint the wood silver to look like metal. That should be fine. And the ATM, well, they had a guy who did computer programming and some graphic work, and all I had to do was just build a screen that he could put his monitor up behind. This is going to be a cinch. The house we found to do this in was out in Brooklyn, way out in Brooklyn. Like, you had to take the subway all the way out and then walk like 11 blocks. So I spent weeks kind of going to the hardware store and carrying like 10-foot-long pieces of wood on the subway, no small feat, and then out to the set in Brooklyn where we built this, I built this. In both of these jobs, you'll notice I never asked anyone for any help. I built this set. I stuck those linoleum stick-on tiles to his carpeted floor, which, you know, when I did the first test seemed just fine. You know, I put it down, pulled it up, wasn't sticky. It's fine. I made all the flats. They said they had some guys who could help me, and I said, well, those guys can paint the flats. And then I went back and started making the ATM machine. And the details are pretty similar to the first story, which is that round about Wednesday afternoon, I realized that the shoot was starting on Saturday morning, and I wasn't anywhere close to ready. And I didn't sleep for about 60 hours straight, getting everything ready, running to hardware stores and working on things. And things started to go really, really wrong. Like the screen I had that went in front of their ATM display cracked, but I thought, oh, it's the urban environment. They'll be fine with that. I'll just tell them it's part of the art direction. And it didn't go over so well. So Saturday morning comes. I go out on set to discover that the flats that they painted for me, I didn't know this in theater. You have to pre-prep the canvas with this stuff. If you just paint it, it could wrinkle and go all over the place. And that's what this ATM machine looked like, a worn out shirt. This room was wrinkled and the wrinkles were going in every direction, and the crew showed up and was like immediately pissed off. And I'm just figuring, I can make this work. I did Gargoyle and Goblin, man. I could run around. I'm running around taking care of things, and everywhere I'm taking care of something, someone's like, hey, what about this? And I'm like, oh, I'll take care of that. And I'm ready, wait, hold on, I'll take care of that. At a certain point, one of the crew said, do you know what you're doing? Do you even know what you're doing? And I thought, this shows how I still thought of myself in that moment. I was going to be the hero of this movie. So I thought, well, maybe a line from Raiders of the Lost Ark would apply here. So I said, I don't know, I'm making this up as I go along. And it was lost on him. He put his hand on my shoulder and said, go home. And that's when I felt like things had really, now it was bad. Now it was really bad. And I went home on Saturday. And I'm not even sure I actually went home. I think, in New York, you don't have to go home if you don't want to. You can just go to a friend's house and go hang out and go eat and stay up all night and do what you will. And Monday morning rolled around. I knew they were done with the shoot, and I went to the set to pick up my toolbox. And my toolbox wasn't there. But it's very specific. There literally was like a taped area on the ground where my toolbox had been, with a note that said, we have your toolbox. Call me, Gabby. And I picked up the phone and I called Gabby. Gabby said, what did you do to me? I trusted you. You screwed us. Do you know that we pulled 2 all-nighters in a row to make this film work? Do you know that the director worked all summer long saving up the money that you pissed away on his set? She said, if you could have done anything to convince me that you were not worthy to be friends with, you've done it. And she said, come here. Come to my room. Come to my apartment. I need to go over every goddamn cent of this budget because we didn't see it. We didn't see it in the set. I want you to account for every penny you spent. And I hung up the phone and I just started crying. I called my dad, and like every other time I had turned to my dad, I don't remember anything my dad said very specifically. I remember him being very clear that all I could do was move forward from this moment. I remember him saying something to that effect, saying, you have to take that you've screwed up and you've got to go talk to them. That's all you can do. And I went and saw Gabby, and somehow, I don't know how this works, what kind of bistro mathematics was involved, but every penny was accounted for in my receipt list somehow. And it took us about 2 hours to go through this with my very clearly ex-friend. And then we finished, and Gabby said, the crew is next door and they want to talk to you. Now I'm thinking this is going to be like a scene from Animal House. Remember where the guy opens the door, he thinks he's on a date, and the girl's boyfriend kicks the shit out of him? And that's what I want to happen. I feel so crappy at this moment that I want someone to beat me up. That will feel like a release. That will feel like I've gotten what I deserve. Really felt like it. And I opened the door, and I'm not exaggerating at all. What I opened the door onto was a dark dorm room with the entire crew of this film surrounded free, a chair in the middle and a spotlight on the chair. At the moment, I thought, well, now it makes a good story, at least, because no one's going to believe that they did this. So, knowing my place, I went and sat dutifully in the chair, and the director pulled out this pad of paper and just started reading all the things that I said I would do in the course of the 2 months that we were working on this film. All the things that I said I would do that I didn't do. And he didn't miss a trick. He really had it all down. I had never made a list this complete. Man, he had every last item. And as he was going through it occasionally, the crew would pipe in with, yeah, man, that really pissed me off. The Greek chorus. To add insult to injury, actually, I want to point out that on Sunday night, when they had already pulled 2 all-nighters making this movie, and they were loading out to find, of course, that I had ruined the carpet in this apartment with my self-stick tiles, I was all the way across town having sex, and they found out about it. They were honorable enough not to mention that, but I knew that they knew, and they knew I knew they knew. And the director said, "Oh, what do you have to say?" And I said, what can I say? You guys said you didn't miss a thing. You're absolutely right. I screwed this up from start to finish. I can't describe to you how awful I feel, how low I feel, how sorry I am. I also understand how totally meaningless my feelings are in this moment, and how meaningless my apology is. And I'm also sorry for that. I'm sorry on like 4 meta levels of sorry. I'm that sorry. And I know that doesn't mean anything either. I know this is a story about my personal failure, but I do want to point out that after I said that, there was this long pause, and the director said, I'm not joking, he said, because I think, I want to say, I think they wanted to fight. They wanted me to go, no, man, I meant to do that. And they go, yo, you didn't. They wanted someone to argue it, and I wasn't giving them that, because, my father was manic depressive. I know how not to argue with someone that's mad at me. I know how to please the room. I was the reed that bends. And so there was this long pause after my 4 meta apologies, and the director said, look, we're not trying to bring you down or anything. I had a therapist years later who pointed out, she was like, do you realize what shitty reinforcement that was for you? How successful your ability to deflect their anger was? So it's terrible reinforcement of your abilities that you should not be using. So there's a quote in the beginning of Ian McEwan's Enduring Love that sticks with me. And I meant to look it up. I forgot to look it up. I'm going to try and paraphrase it. But the analogy really works for me. He says at one point, in describing the opening of this book, is him and 4 people in a public park watching a balloon accident, and they're running towards this balloon accident. And he describes it it's an amazing first chapter. And he describes that there was just a moment when they heard a sound and a moment when they were running. There was no decision made. They just were running, and he saw these people coalescing from the different corners of the space. And he says, we were running towards a kind of catastrophe in whose furnace our lives and our characters would be buckled into new shapes. And that's what I have realized over my life has happened in those moments. I mean, there's a lot of things you can do when you screw something up badly. A lot of people deflect. A lot of people ignore. A lot of people blame. Now, I've definitely not been one of those people, and I don't trust people that don't think that they've failed. People, I've worked at risk-averse places where if you start to screw up a job, they just send you more people without telling you that you're going over budget, and everyone feels like they do great. I don't trust working with some of those people because they don't know. Their characters haven't withstood having totally been responsible for screwing something up and recovering and moving on. It's co-vatimus. Where are we going? Somewhere in my early 20s, I managed to figure out that I was thinking something totally different than I thought 2 years previously. And I just made that as a little mark in my head. Whatever you think now, you're probably wrong. And so if I think of one quality that makes a skeptic, that makes me a skeptic at heart, it's having totally screwed up. It's failure. And I'm not talking about that failure is always an option that we joke about on the show. I mean, it's abject screwing something up, losing a friend, hurting someone you love, breaking something that you care about. The other thing that's important about that, and I feel nervous when I start quoting too much from books that I love because I feel like it's a weird sort of proselytizing. It makes me feel like a preacher. But Rilke has this amazing letter in Letters to a Young Poet where he's counseling the young poet, and he says, we find our moments of sadness. Again, I'm paraphrasing, but it's translated from the German, so who cares? It's my translation. he says, we find our moments of sadness terrifying because we find ourselves standing in a place we cannot remain standing. The past has left us and the future has not taken hold. He says, wait, where is it? The future has not yet taken hold. He says, but we have changed as a house changes into which someone has entered. And he says, and this is why it's so important to be lonely and attentive. And I love that particular translation because there's nothing lonelier than taking responsibility for something you've done. He says, this is why it's important to be lonely and attentive when one is sad, because that's the point at which the change in your character occurs. Later on, he explains, it'll seem to happen as if from outside, and he calls it the noisy and fortuitous time from outside. He says, that's the moment right there where the switch gets turned, and that's where you've got to be attentive to it. Lastly, I want to point out that my favorite hero of all fictional heroes is Philip Marlowe from Raymond Chandler. And in The Simple Art of Murder, Chandler describes his hero, and after giving all of his wonderful qualities, and it's a beautiful essay to read, and I recommend if you like Chandler and you haven't read it, you read it right away, because it's quite shocking how knowledgeable Chandler was of exactly the kind of hero he was creating. He gives all of his qualities, and wow, you see them all in the book. You realize every scene he wrote, he was following all of these qualities. But in the end, he says, if the world were full of people like him, it would be a very safe place to live in without being too boring to be worth living in. And that is what I have striven to be. I take counsel from Chandler's hero. I take counsel from Marlowe and the number of times that Marlowe screws up. And I think about the fact that a person of honor takes responsibility for what they've done and they move on, and that's all you can do. Thank you.
Dr. Kamp, Los Angeles. Who is the German philosopher that you quoted, please?
The German philosopher was Rilke. The book is Letters to a Young Poet. Rilke also... actually, Rilke wrote another quote that is one of my father's all-time favorite quotes, which was he wrote an amazing monograph on Rodin. And for the record, Rodin couldn't stand Rilke. He hated this tubercular little shrew that was following him around for several weeks. But the opening line of his monograph on Rodin is amazing. He said it begins with a man. It begins with a name. It is a famous name, but what is fame but the sum of all the misunderstandings that surround a name?